Hearing anything?
Professor Rawls,
Okay. What? Okay. I meant to bring in, I had done up copies of Marx's Critique of the Goethe Program, 1975. The whole thing is retired. There's only excerpts in the Cleland. And I'm afraid I'm a little absent on it. I keep forgetting it. But it will be available for the sections, I hope, if I don't forget it, on Wednesday. And I hope we will pick it up then. It does contain the whole text, which I think has some interesting points in it that unfortunately missed in the selection in the flower. The last time, what's today, Monday, on last Wednesday, I talked about Marx's economic views a bit, and I'm afraid I have to end up somewhat hurriedly. I will not try to say all the things if I had a little bit more time there. I might have been able to say, I think I will, so to speak, keep going and hope that somehow it will fill in. You recall that what I did, I gave a general description or characterization of capitalism as a social system divided into these two classes, each of which had a different function in the economic scheme as a whole. And I then went on and commented on what the aim was of the later theory of value. And in particular, I was concerned to say it doesn't have three aims that people have from time to time thought it had. One of them is, say, as a genetic explanation of the source of value, namely labor. And one nice thing about the beginning part of Critique of the Goethe Program is that Marx gives an explanation why he rejects that. Another explanation in view of, it appears that Marx used the term exploitation and so forth, perhaps some account of what a just theory of prices it would be. And I made a suggestion that I think quite plainly this is that. I think on the whole that Marx employs the term exploitation within his economic theory as an economic notion, and it ought not to be defined, I think, as a moral notion within that scheme of his economic theory. And finally, I don't think it's in the ordinary sense that the classical economists or present-day academic economists would think of it as a theory of price. Although Marx makes various assumptions in volume 1 that indicates that there is proportionality in all of his assumptions between prices and labor value as he defines it. I think the aim of the view is, as I mentioned very briefly, to understand how it's possible that capitalism, which he characterizes as a system of personal independence, with everybody free and equal in some formal sense at least, and able to contract on the market freely, how within that sort of system surplus of value can be extracted, to use his word, which is the same thing as how exploitation can exist in his sense of exploitation, how that is defined. The other thing he's trying to explain is how all that can happen as if surplus value be extracted without the agents in the system being aware that that's what's happening. And indeed supposing that on all these markets, some sense that if there's not monopoly, if there's not force, if it's not fraud, why then prices are fair by the conception of justice that applies to this economic system. So he then said, you should pay attention often through when he's characterizing the economic system, but between how things appear and what's, as it were, going on beneath the institutional appearances of the economic system. And particularly important here is the last section of chapter 1 of volume 1 of Capital, where he talks about commodity fetishism, so to speak. I hope at some point to be able to get back to that. So I then interpret his economic views, which is an idea not at all original, of course, with me. The most elaborate account of it I know is by an economist named Bummel in the Journal of Economic Literature a few years ago, where he gives this interpretation. And the idea is to explain the 2 points that I mentioned and to keep track of the flows of labor values in the economy, not because that's a theory of price, but to keep track of how surplus value is being extracted and could benefit from that. If we tie together the fourth section of chapter 1 in volume 1 with Marx's account of what turns out to be, from the standpoint of a later age, marginal productivity theory of distribution in chapter 48, volume 3, under the so-called Trinity formula. If we tie those together, we then, I think, although I'm afraid I won't have a chance to go into that, as to how these things are concealed and how he hopes that his own view will make them clear to us. Well, so I pass on today to the third of the two, the second of the three classes here on Marx. Let's try to which I listed as the critique of liberalism, of its conception of right and justice. So I'll begin on that now. Let's think of liberalism, which is plainly a very complicated notion and lots of variations on it. First, in terms of how it differs from, and say its influence in part helped to change, the regime of the modern state as a scheme of royal absolutism, say in the middle of the 17th century. Perhaps the best example of that is the regime of Louis XIV in France, and also a much less forceful example, because it had a lot of opposition, is the attempt of the Stuart kings to govern in that way in England. Now consider these changes from the regime of royal absolutism. If you think of it as an alliance under the leadership or the directorship of the crown, then it's an alliance between, could be used to say, altar and throne and the aristocracy. And one would, and there is behaving at the following sort of changes over time. First of all, there were constitutional limitations on the exercise of royal power as executive power. We talked about this in Locke's second treatise. Next, one might put constitutional limitations on the exercise of royal power as legislative power, as opposed to executive power. For example, as the crown and parliament, that's the English phrase. And again, Locke's second treatise would be an example of that. Thirdly, we could say a constitutional principle affirming in some form the principle of toleration. And here, while there still may be an established church, other churches are tolerated and increasingly accepted. And here would be Locke's letter on toleration, and also in a later form, in Mill's essay on liberty. Fourthly, we could say there are various constitutional extensions of the franchise, access to political office beyond the aristocracy, extending it at least to the middle class in the early period and eventually to the working class, let's say by the end, or at least towards the end, that is developing in the 19th century. And here we might take an example of this consideration of that. Mill's representative government, we didn't read that, but it's very much concerned with that problem, and indeed indirectly so with on liberty concerned with that problem. Then there's the principle of equality of opportunity in some form, as the old phrase was, careers open to talents, or with access to social and economic opportunities to all classes in society. And Mill discusses this, and he's very much concerned with this in the essay of which I did not discuss, but which I hope you will read, Subjection of Women. So I suppose we take these 5 principles interpreted in some form as representing what liberalism meant in the mid-19th century, and we can take Mill as an example. There would certainly not be any better example. Of course, I remind you, as I said before, that there are lots of variations on how these principles are interpreted and combined, and I haven't said anything about the particular social policies with which they are associated or which these principles were used to support, sort of talking about it at a fairly abstract level. Now, from Marx's point of view, I think these constitutional, political, and social principles which define liberal institutions simply represent the ideas and principles which specify and regulate the system of personal independence, which is characteristic of capitalism as a social system. I emphasize this idea of personal independence, which is a phrase he uses in the Grundrisse. For Marx, capitalism remains, as I've emphasized last time, just as much as feudalism, a social system in which surplus value is extracted. And so it is, by definition of exploitation, a system of exploitation. Keep in mind, as I mentioned in introductory comments, that taking within Marx's economic system the term exploitation as not the moral notion. Any system that extracts surplus value, that is, in which produces surplus value without being based on an institution of free associated producers that makes that decision, is, I think, from Marx, exploited. That's how he's going to define and to use that term. So the exploitation is simply a feature defined in economic and institutional terms of a certain kind, or perhaps since there are a number of them, certain kinds of social and economic systems. One of Marx's problems in capitalism, I have said, is to explain first how exploitation is possible in a system of personal independence, and second, to explain how it is hidden from view. So neither capitalists nor workers are aware in general that it is being extracted. Now, there are, of course, many sides to Marx's critique of liberalism. On the Jewish question, 1843, he criticizes the liberal view of the significance of political rights as a form of emancipation, in contrast with full human emancipation, which he thinks can be achieved only in his notion of full communist society. And in the critique of the Goethe program in 1875, he criticizes other socialists for their retrograde step in emphasizing the importance of this distributed justice, as if distribution is somehow independent of the mode of production and can alone be changed, and so on. All those are things that he discusses rather briefly, but I think quite clearly in the critique of the Goethe program. Rather than discuss either these writings or his more involved views of the latter part of the German ideology, and the side of Marx's criticism of liberalism that they illustrate, the thing I plan to do today is to examine Marx's view in On Capital, and to look at, I only have a chance to do that at a few places where justice is mentioned. There are very few references to it in the long text, but there are some, and I will mention a couple of those. It turns out, I think, that what one would infer from these references is consistent with what he says in these other places. So as a preliminary remark on this is Marx's view, I think, that certain conceptions of right and justice are part of what he calls and this is a common phrase, but I assume everyone knows, the superstructure of capitalist society. But I think that just knowing that is not by itself very helpful in explaining what his doctrine is. I think we must also have an idea of how conceptions of right and justice are ideological. That is to say, how, as perceptions, the principles of which govern the system of personal independence, they serve to hide the fact that surplus value is being extracted beneath the institutional surface, as it were, of the market and of the other institutions of society. I note briefly here, and I will come back to it on Friday when I talk about the notion in such time as we have of a full communist society. I note a distinction between two kinds of ideological consciousness. Recall that ideological consciousness is always in some sense false consciousness. So I do not think of philosophy or other philosophical views in general as ideologies. They're only ideologies that, first of all, they're in some way false or incorrect, and if those who hold them are in some way deceived or mistaken about things, then only if they play some kind of role in society. So that's Marx's sense of it, and that's how I will always use that term. If I don't, if it slips, or I'm not paying attention to what I should say. So, first of all, there's ideological consciousness as an illusion, and ideological consciousness as a delusion. IL in one case, EL being, and DE being preface in the other. In the first case, where it's an illusion, we are fooled. We are taken in by the institutional appearances, say the institutional appearances of the market, which Marx argues in Capital, Chapter 1, Volume 1, Section 4, that these appearances conceal from us that what's actually being exchanged is labor. Certain, as it were, amounts of labor time are being concealed. And that is concealed by us from the surface of the market and everything taking place through price exchanges. We don't perceive what's actually going on. We're taken in by that, or we're fooled. And it's like he compares it to optical illusions. We're taken in by the perceptual appearances. In the second case, where we talk about a delusion, the idea is that we are deluded the way we think people are deluded, that they hold these views from some subjective or psychological need of some kind. They need to believe these things. They need to affirm these views, where the need is supported or cultivated by their place in the social system and by how that system works, and the system in a way depends upon people affirming and holding these views. And an example of this is Marx's view, say, of religion, of which he thinks, well, once the need disappears for this form of faith in communist society, it will no longer exist, or that form of ideological consciousness will no longer exist. Well, when we read Capital, I'm not going to say a few things about the notion of justice in this text. When we read Capital, we may easily take for granted that we are reading an account of what Marx believes is an unjust social system. Marx describes a society divided into two classes, where a small class of people own all the means of production and live in relative affluence compared to other people. The capitalists appropriate the product of labor of others, and they use it for an accumulation of greater wealth. And the other class, as we talked about the other day, the workers, own nothing but their labor power, of which they are forced to sell to some member of the capitalist class for a wage that is often just sufficient to cover the costs of producing and the reproducing of the labor power, so-called subsistence wage. So also in the text, Marx constantly speaks of capitalists as exploiting the workers and as appropriating product that workers produce by unpaid or surplus labor, and then selling the profit for profit. Surely, given the language that we think that Marx uses in his description of capitalism as a social system, he must believe that capitalism is unjust. Yet, when we consider Marx's writings, we seem to find the following. First, that there is no attempt by Marx in Capital or elsewhere to present a philosophical or moral argument to the effect that capitalism is unjust. Nor does Marx propose a conception of justice in the light of which the condemnation of capitalism as unjust would be supported. Another point is this, is that there seems to be no explicit assertion in Capital that capitalism is unjust, or contrary to principled justice or the basic rights of persons. There is in some passages a certain sarcasm about his account of equal rights and various other attitudes expressed. But there is no explicit assertion of that within some philosophical context that would imply that he is saying, and regards this as important, that the capitalism is unjust. In addition to this, we find third that Marx criticizes the utopian socialists who did, that's his name for them in some places, who did condemn capitalism as unjust and who advocated various kinds of socialist schemes as a way of establishing a just social system. And a part of Marx's criticism of the utopian socialists is that they think it's important to criticize capitalism as unjust, whereas he, I think, does not. Finally, 4, although it is clear that Marx has strong moral feelings and attitudes which are deeply hostile to capitalism, and feelings and attitudes which we easily recognize and indeed which are moral feelings and attitudes, he even says in a few places in Capital that capitalism is not unjust. For example, as assessed by the standards which are appropriate to it, the wage under capitalism is perfectly fair. Now, if these remarks that I have just made are correct, then our initial expectations as to Marx's meaning would seem to be mistaken. For the points I mentioned suggest the following kinds of inferences about Marx's intention, which I will proceed to take up. First, that there is a conception of justice appropriate to capitalism, or perhaps a conception appropriate to each mode of production, during a time when that mode of production is fulfilling its historical role. Judged by this conception of justice, capitalism is just on this view. Of course, this is compatible with there being many particular instances of injustice under a capitalist regime. For any social system may fall short of its own standards. It may do so a good bit of the time. And nevertheless, there is, on this view, a conception of justice and a basic right appropriate to capitalism, and when this conception is realized, capitalism is perfectly just. A second inference that we might make is that the neighbor theory of value, whatever its purpose is not aimed at showing that capitalism is unjust. We went over that the last time, what the purpose of it is, as I mentioned someone at the beginning, is not a theory then of just price and its aims or difference. Finally, and the third inference that we might make is that of whatever philosophical or moral argument that Marx would give for socialism, it would not be an argument based on a conception of justice or on the rights of persons. Perhaps he would not have given a moral or philosophical argument of any kind, or developed an explicit argument of any kind. But if he would, it would be presuming in terms of other kinds of values. And I think this is the case, that in terms of other kinds of values and values of right and justice. I suggest then something like the following in this sort of preliminary remark about how I'm interpreting and what I think to be at any rate an interpretation of his view, not by any means the only one, but a one, which I don't think is a plausible. He thinks first that a full communist society is one in which conceptions of justice and the rights of persons do not have any significant role. It is a society, we might say, beyond justice in some way. And what I will hope to do is explain perhaps the next time on Friday what we might mean by that. Marx also thinks, second, that the circumstances which produce the need for conceptions of rights and justice are precisely circumstances in which the requirements of these conceptions cannot be adequately satisfied, even if we were to affirm them. Conceptions of right and justice are in this sense inapplicable or incoherent. They impose a demand that cannot be met under those conditions when they would be needed. This is illustrated, I think, by his view of righteous justice and on the Jewish question. These ideas are said to arise as part of civil society, as boundary lines protecting egoistic individuals against one another, and the rights of citizens, which appear to offer a kind of emancipation, political emancipation, prove illusory. And this is because the worth of these rights is overridden by inequalities of wealth and property ownership in the background, which then determine the real bases of political and social power. And of course, it is that scheme of property ownership that behind the institutional appearances of the capitalist regime is what makes exploitation possible. So, to conclude then, liberalism assumes that it is impossible to get beyond justice. So it's, as it were, I say, a permanent feature of human society. Marx thinks it is possible to get beyond it, and beyond that he thinks, in fact, it will be achieved and not all that far a distant future. Now, one might be tempted to go over and mention various ways in which one could counter the views that I have suggested. That is, we could explain why it is that although Marx did not, if it is correct what I just said, does not say in capital, give an argument that capitalism is unjust, and it doesn't make the kinds of assertions about that that we would expect, one might say, but all the same he believed it was unjust, and he had a variety of reasons for not saying that. And there are a number of possibilities here. Perhaps one might say he dislikes, and this is certainly true, he disliked preaching and moralizing, and even if he believes that something is unjust, he prefers to make other arguments and not to say that. And also one might say that for a variety of reasons he wants to distance himself from the utopian socialists who did make these sorts of arguments. And one way to do that is to avoid making those kinds of arguments and to present a certain kind of economic view about the laws of motion of capitalism, and try to make the argument depends on that. And certainly it is the case that Marx does that, but I don't think that explanation for why there isn't that these explicit assertions in Capital and some philosophically developed view question whether those are sufficient to explain what needs to be explained. In any case, we'll make an alternative suggestion as to why we don't find these assertions and have kind of developed a view in Capital. Namely, the idea is that justice is a juridical conception that obtains only a certain period of time. I will go into this. Perhaps the explanation that I'm suggesting of why Marx does not criticize capitalism as unjust, and even seems to say that it is just, is the following. He thinks that the conception of justice as a political, he thinks of the conception of justice as a political and juridical conception that goes with the institutional separation of state and society. This institutional separation presupposes the need for the state, and thus presupposes thus presupposes the existence of a dominating and a dominated class. When the state exists, exploitation in Marxist sense also exists. And political and legal institutions belong to what we earlier called, and the well-known term for this, belongs to the superstructure. These institutions have a regulatory role and are adjusted to the requirements of the forces of production and the relations of production. Each social form, each kind of economic organization and mode of production has a distinctive conception of justice that is appropriate for its political and juridical institutions. It embodies what they need, and it stresses the principles that regulate from the standpoint of political systems their activities. When these institutions are properly adjusted to the underlying mode of production, they serve in the best way the operative requirements of the mode of production. I believe that, for Marx then, those properly adjusted institutions of the superstructure embody and incorporate a conception of justice which best serves the historical role of the underlying economic mode of production. Capitalism, like any other form of social and economic organization, has a correctly adjusted superstructure and a conception of justice appropriate to it. This conception is the one that best serves capitalism's historical role. The suggested explanation then is as follows. On Marx's view, capitalism, especially in its time period, that is to say, the period when it is effectively carrying out its historical role of building up the means of production in an effective, efficient way, is not unjust. For there is a conception of justice appropriate to capitalism, and by this conception it is just by and large. And naming aside all these particular instances, like in every socialist scheme, this conception is violated. Other conceptions of justice are, at this time, simply irrelevant. They may apply to other economic modes of production which have existed in previous times or which may exist in later times to come, but they do not apply in the historical conditions of capitalism in the period of time when it's fulfilling its historical role effectively. Thus, there is no conception, on Marx's view, there will be no conception of justice that is always applicable or that applies to all social forms. In this sense, there are for Marx no universally valid principles of justice. Whether a conception of justice applies to a particular political and social system is settled by whether it is appropriate to the existing mode of production and its historical role. There is one passage in Capital that suggests this kind of view. It's in volume 3. In my edition, I was distressed to find that all editions Capital are not by any means the same, and the German is not necessarily the same as the English. It's unfortunate. But at any rate, the English edition, volume 21, no, chapter 21, chapter is not that long, it seems long. Chapter 21 of volume 3. It's at the beginning of the chapter, and it's on interest-bearing capital. Marx says the following. It's a rather long quotation, but I think it's interesting. I'll make some comments about it. Quotation begins here. To speak here of natural justice, as Gilbart does, Gilbart does, is nonsense. The justice of transactions which go on between agents of production rest on the fact that these transactions arise as natural consequences from the relations of production. The juridical forms in which these economic transactions appear as voluntary actions of the participants and as contracts that may be enforced by the state against a single party cannot determine this content, since they are mere forms. They, that is, these juridical forms, merely express it. This content is just whenever it corresponds to the mode of production. Whenever this content is adequate to this mode. That's the important sentence. I'll read it again. This content is just whenever it corresponds to the mode of production, whenever the content is adequate to this mode. This content is unjust whenever it contradicts this mode of production. Slavery on the basis of the capitalist mode of production is unjust. So also is fraud in the quality of commodities. And that's the end of the quote. Now it's a fairly unclear quote. There's some terms in it to comment on. I'm not sure I'm correct about how to interpret them, but at any rate I will try. This passage occurs when Marx is discussing interest-bearing capital. And in a footnote, he quotes Gilbart from a book in London, 1834, as saying the following, again a quotation. That a man who borrows money with a view to making a profit by it should give some proportion of his profit to the lender is a self-evident principle of natural justice. So Gilbart here is cited as quoting this as, say, a principle of natural law, or something of that kind. Marx says that the payment of interest is not a matter of self-evident principle of natural justice. Rather, the payment of interest arises as a natural consequence of supply and demand for funds in the money market, as this market exists within the framework of capitalism. A loan is a valid contract within the capitalist scheme, and the legal system will enforce it. Well, it isn't anything to do with a natural law. It arises as a result of supply and demand and the market for funds, and the legal system will enforce it. Now, this passage by itself is not, of course, an account of the conception of justice under capitalism, but it does suggest several points. First, there is a distinction which Marx makes between juridical forms, for example, the juridical form of a valid contract, as, say, to an agreement to make a loan or purchase of some kind, so some particular kind of commodity or whatever, and the content of these forms. The same juridical forms, like the notion of a contract, the form of a contract is a general legal notion, may be found in many different legal systems and may apply to economic transactions under widely different modes of production in different kinds of societies. On the other hand, I assume that the content of the juridical form of contract, the general notion of contract, say, refers to the specific kinds of contracts that can be legally made and that will be enforced by the legal system. Thus, under capitalism, a contract into slavery, say or for the buying and selling of slaves, is void, ab initio, will not be enforced. In that sense, it's unjust. And that's part of the content of that juridical form under capitalist regime. I assume also that the content of the juridical form of contract covers the various conditions under which valid contracts are made, kinds of things that have to be satisfied, and so forth. So that fraud and deception and entering into these in certain kinds of condition also invalidates the contract, and that would be part of the content of these forms under capitalism. Thus, under capitalism, fraud and deception in making agreements would also be ruled out as unjust, as everything else plainly incompatible with the regime of free contract. Second inference that I'm sort of would draw on the basis of the passage is that it seems that whether slavery or fraud and so forth is unjust under some mode of production is settled by whether or not permitting slavery or fraudulent practices specifies the content for the law of contract which is most adequate to the existing mode of production and well adapted to the operation of this mode as it carries out, of course, have to keep in mind in the background, its historical role efficiently. Recall that this historical role, in the case of capitalism, is the rapid building up of real capital, real investment in plants and machines and so forth, and the development of the technology to use it in innovative ways. Hence, the juridical form of the law of contract under capitalism is most adequate when its content is adjusted so as to enable this mode of production to fulfill its role of accumulating capital in the most effective way. And since slavery, on Marx's view, is incompatible with this, with the requirements of capitalism as a mode of production, it is unjust. One essential feature of capitalism is that it's a system of free competitive market, including free market for the hiring of labor power. In this connection is Marx's view that the competitive way, Marx's view in this connection is having the form of market with the labor relation is an essential feature of the system and is perfectly just, provided that the workers are paid the full value of their labor power. That is the equivalent of the socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce and to reproduce the workers' labor power. In discussing the labor contract in Chapter 7, Volume 1 of Capital, Marx says the following. This is in the McClellan at page 467. So perhaps since time is a little bit short, if you will read that, I won't read the passage entirely. I'll just call to your attention, it ends up with the phrase that the capitalists may seem to us, to paraphrase briefly, could be gained on balance by this, but then it ends up with saying it is by no means an injury to the seller, that is, to the worker who sells the labor power. It is not, Marx implies here, then I take it, it is no injury. I read the word injury to mean no injustice. As Marx says below, some lines down, equivalent has been exchanged for equivalent. And so the conception of justice appropriate to capitalism, the way I'm reading this passage, is satisfied. Now there is a good bit of sarcasm in this passage. Now I'm interpreting the sarcasm to be an expression of hostility, which of course is pervasive throughout Capital, but I'm interpreting it as based on other moral notions and not incompatible with saying that in accordance with capitalism's notion of justice, which is the only one that is relevant in this context, as that kind of notion is nevertheless satisfied. So paying workers less than their value less than the value of their labor power would be, on Marx's view of his understanding of what justice requires under capitalism, that would be unjust. And this is a far more interesting, I think, and relevant example than the example of slavery, which is that's far-fetched. But that he affirms that the wage relation, equivalent, state equivalent, is within this scheme perfectly just, is an interesting example, I think. So I'm saying that it is Marx's view that under the capitalism as a system of free competition, when wages are perfectly just. And not always, of course there are lots of exceptions, but in general, whenever equivalent is paid for, equivalent in terms of exchange of necessary labor times, and he does assume in many cases in capital that condition is satisfied. Now, put somewhat differently, Marx believes that capitalism is a system of exploitation. That is, a system of extraction of labor power, just as under feudalism, just as much so. And under feudalism, the exploitation is visible and open to view because feudalism was an institution of personal dependence. The serf was required by the lord to work so many days a year on the lord's field and was severely punished if that was not done. So it's open to view, and one knows exactly the ratio of exploitation and it's visible in institutions. Under capitalism, economic transactions that proceed under a regime of free contract between independent persons who are equal persons in the eyes of the law. And Marx comments that in the wage contract, there is no way for any mind to tell as to how it is perceived and written down of how many hours are necessary for the workers to work in order to earn equivalent for what's required to reproduce their labor power and how much is surplus value. Just as you work 8 hours a day or however many hours a day for 5 days a week, and nobody knows, and it doesn't occur to them to ask how much of it is necessary in labor time in that sense, and how much of it is unpaid labor. So, well, I will stop here, but the point is there isn't anything in the institutional form that reveals that fact, whereas there is, and it's obvious in the case of feudalism. Well, I better stop here and then pick up beginning here on the side.
No, we'll go over that. Full value is